Was Legolas actually special, or just an ordinary elf? LOTR lore. Here is something that will quietly rearrange how you think about one of the most recognizable figures in all of fantasy literature. Legolas Greenleaf, Prince of the Woodland Realm, Archer of the Fellowship, the elf who surfs a shield down a staircase and single-handedly dismantles an Oliphaunt in roughly 45 seconds of screen time, is not described anywhere in Tolkien's writing as exceptional. No prophecy names him, no ancient title elevates him. No Vala singles him out. He attends the Council of Elrond as a messenger, not a champion. He joins the Fellowship as a representative, and Tolkien, in the letter where he explains the composition of that fellowship, does not linger on Legolas at all. 9 walkers, 1 elf, and Tolkien moves on. This is not an oversight. This is not a gap waiting to be filled with film mythology. This is, when you follow it all the way down through the Silmarillion, through unfinished tales, through the appendices and the letters, the precise and deliberate shape of something Tolkien was doing with extraordinary care and almost no announcement. The question this video is going to live inside is this: did Tolkien make Legolas ordinary on purpose? And if so, does that change what every single one of his moments in the story actually means? Do not answer that yet. Just hold it. Because to understand what Legolas is, you first have to understand what he is not. And that requires going somewhere the films never once took you. It requires going to the very beginning of the Elvish world. The Silmarillion opens the question before Legolas is even conceivable as a character. In the chapter titled Of the Coming of the Elves and the Captivity of Melkor, Tolkien establishes what will become the central fault line of all Elvish civilization, a fault line so deep and so defining that it shapes every elf you will ever encounter in the Legendarium, including the one standing in Rivendell, volunteering for a journey into Mordor. The elves awoke at Cuiviénen, beside the Waters of Awakening, in the far east of Middle-earth. And the Valar, having found them, made a choice that would echo down every age of the world. They invited the elves to come to Valinor, to leave Middle-earth, to cross the ocean and dwell in the undying lands, in the presence of the powers, in the light of the 2 trees that illuminated the world before the sun and moon existed. Some went, some did not. That choice, made by individual elves in the earliest dark of the world, becomes the most consequential act of sorting in all of Tolkien's mythology. The ones who completed the great journey, who crossed the misty mountains and the wide plains and finally the sea, who stood in Valinor and saw the light of Telperion and Lorelin, those elves were changed by that light. They became the Calaquendi, the light elves, and the transformation was not merely symbolic. Tolkien means it cosmologically. To have stood in that light is to have been marked by it, deepened by it, made into something more fully realized than what you were before. The Noldor, the Vanyar, the Teleri who made it across. These are not just culturally superior elves. They are ontologically different. The light got inside them. And the ones who turned back, or who never made the journey at all. Tolkien calls them, with a word that lands like a verdict, the Moriquendi. The Dark Elves. Not evil, not malicious, just, by the cosmological grammar of Arda, lesser, untouched by the light, unreached by the full flowering of what elvish existence was supposed to become. They remained in Middle-earth while the world-defining events of the First Age unfolded in Valinor, and when those events spilled back into Middle-earth in fire and ruin and the wars of the Valar against Morgoth, the Dark Elves were there but not of it, witnesses to a drama whose deepest significance had happened somewhere they had never been. Now here is where it gets specific, and where it gets devastating for everything Peter Jackson's films imply about Legolas. The elves of Mirkwood, the Wood Elves, the ones Legolas calls his people, are primarily descended from the Nandor. And the Nandor are not simply elves who did not complete the great journey. They are elves who turned back from it. They were part of the Teleri, the 3rd great tribe of elves, and somewhere in the crossing of the misty mountains, their leader Lenwë looked ahead at what lay between them and Valinor, and said, "No, not this way. Not for me." And a portion of the Teleri followed him south and east and into the forests, and they became the Nandor, and their descendants became the Sylvan Elves, and the Sylvan Elves of Mirkwood became, eventually, the people over whom Thranduil rules, and among whom Legolas grew up. Picture this. You are standing at the foot of a mountain range at the beginning of the world, before the sun exists, before history has happened yet, before anything has been written or lost or won. Ahead of you is a journey of almost unimaginable length toward a light you have been told is the most beautiful thing in existence. Behind you is the dark and the familiar, and the woods where you woke up, and someone in your group turns and says, "I am going back," and you follow them. Not out of cowardice, necessarily, not out of stupidity, maybe out of love for what already is. Maybe out of a bone-deep attachment to the dark and the trees and the earth that no promise of distant light can displace, and you walk back into the forest. That choice, made by the ancestors of Legolas's people thousands of years before Legolas exists, defines his entire cultural inheritance. Every elf who meets him in the wider world of the Legendarium carries that context, even if they never say it aloud. The Noldor who see him know what he is. The Sindar who interact with him know what his people are. The hierarchies of elvish civilization are not subtle, and the Sylvan Elves of Mirkwood sit at the bottom of them. Which brings us to Thranduil. Here is something worth pausing on, because it complicates the picture in a way the films never acknowledged. Thranduil is not Sylvan. He is Sindarin, meaning he is descended from Teleri, who did complete most of the Great Journey, who reached Beleriand in the First Age and built kingdoms there, but who never crossed the sea to Valinor. The Sindar are a step above the Nandor in the elvish hierarchy, touched by a lesser light, the light of Middle-earth rather than Valinor, but more prestigious than those who turned back entirely. Thranduil's father, Orifer, led a group of Sindar into the Sylvan territories east of the Misty Mountains, apparently uncomfortable with the increasing dominance of the Noldor over the Sindarin realms of Beleriand, and made himself king of the Sylvan elves already living there. What Unfinished Tales reveals, almost in passing, is that this was not entirely a comfortable arrangement. The Sylvan elves had their own culture, their own way of being in the world, and Orifer, and then Thranduil after him, adapted to that culture as much as they shaped it. Tolkien notes that Thranduil's people had deliberately cultivated a simpler, more woodland existence, less lore-rich, less concerned with the great matters of the wider world, more rooted in the physical reality of the forest around them. So Legolas is the son of a Sindarin king who rules a Sylvan people in a realm that has consciously chosen to be less connected to the larger currents of elvish civilization, in a forest that has been slowly corrupted by Sauron's influence and renamed Mirkwood because of the shadow creeping through it. This is not the background of an elvish elite. This is the background of someone from a place the wider world has already half forgotten. And then the Council of Elrond convenes. Pay attention to why Legolas is at Rivendell, because this is where the films do something so seamlessly misleading that most viewers never notice it. In Peter Jackson's version, Legolas is simply there. He is a warrior, he is magnificent, he volunteers, and the visual grammar of the scene communicates that, of course, an elf like this would be part of a fellowship like this. He belongs there aesthetically. He belongs there in terms of the film's internal logic. But in Tolkien's text, Legolas is at the Council of Elrond because he was sent there as a messenger, by his father, to deliver news about Gollum, who had been captured by the Wood Elves and subsequently escaped. That is the reason for his presence. He is not a warrior ambassador dispatched to represent elvish military power. He is carrying what amounts to very bad news about a prisoner who got away. Tolkien writes it plainly in the Council of Elrond. Legolas stands and delivers his report about Gollum's escape, and the council hears it, and then the conversation moves on. And then at the end, when the fellowship is being assembled, Legolas is chosen as one of the 9. But the text does not explain why. That silence is extraordinary. Tolkien explains almost everything else about the Fellowship's composition. Gandalf is its leader because of who he is. Aragorn goes because of who he is, and because the quest depends on him eventually. Boromir represents Gondor. Gimli represents the dwarves. The four hobbits go because Frodo must go, and his companions will not leave him. Tolkien accounts for every member in one way or another. For Legolas, the text simply says that Elrond chose a fellowship of 9, and Legolas is one of the 9, and that is all. Now think about what was available. Glorfindel is in Rivendell. Let that land for a moment. Glorfindel, who in Unfinished Tales is identified explicitly as a Maya-empowered being, rehoused in a new body by the Valar themselves, sent back from the halls of Mandos, specifically because the war against Sauron would require figures of that caliber in Middle-earth. Glorfindel, who killed a Balrog in the First Age, and whose spiritual power is so concentrated that even the Lord of the Nazgul flinches from direct confrontation with him. Glorfindel, whose name the Witch King has apparently been given as prophecy, which is why he does not press the assault on the road to Rivendell. That elf is standing in Rivendell when the Fellowship departs, and he stays behind. A wood elf prince, the son of a king who ruled a diminished realm in a corrupted forest, who showed up to deliver bad news about an escaped prisoner, goes instead. Why? Tolkien does not say, but his cosmological logic says it for him, if you know where to listen. The principle is stated most clearly, not in the main text of The Lord of the Rings, but in Tolkien's letter 297, written late in his life, in response to a reader query, and it connects to something even older in his mythology, a theme running from the music of the Ainur all the way to the Shire. Tolkien had a deep and abiding conviction, rooted in his Catholicism and expressed through his entire legendarium, that the great acts of power in the world, the moments that actually change things, tend to happen not through the overwhelming application of strength, but through the agency of those the world has underestimated or overlooked. Not because strength is bad, but because strength, in Tolkien's cosmology, carries its own corruption risk. The greater the power, the greater the danger of reaching for the wrong thing at the wrong moment. Think about who he keeps at home. Glorfindel stays in Rivendell. Galadriel stays in Lothlorien. Elrond stays in Rivendell. Tom Bombadil, whatever he is, stays in his valley. The most powerful figures in the free world, the ones who could conceivably challenge Sauron directly, are precisely the ones who cannot go, because the ring would find them irresistible, and they would become something worse than Sauron himself. Tolkien is not careless about this. He is deliberate. The ones who can carry this burden are the ones for whom the burden is not also a temptation of world historical proportions. Now apply that logic not just to the hobbits but to Legolas. Glorfindel joining the Fellowship would be extraordinary. It would make the Fellowship feel like an army. It would shift the story's weight away from Frodo and toward an elvish military operation. Every moment Glorfindel was present, the gravitational center of every scene would pull toward him, because that is what he is, a center of gravity. The hobbits, and Frodo especially, would become background figures in their own story. But Legolas brings elvish perception, elvish endurance, elvish archery. He brings what a wood elf brings, knowledge of the natural world, an attunement to forest and sky and stone that is genuinely useful on a journey through the wilderness. He brings a set of capabilities that complement the Fellowship without overwhelming it. And he brings something else, something that only becomes visible when you understand where he comes from. He brings the Sylvan Elves, because Legolas is not just an individual, he is a representative. And when Elrond assembles 9 walkers to represent the free peoples against Sauron's 9 ringwraiths, the Sylvan Elves of Mirkwood, the Wood Elves, the Morroquendi, the ones who turned back from the great journey, the ones who never walked in Valinor's light, those elves are in the Fellowship. For the first time in the great events of the Legendarium, the least prestigious elvish kindred is at the center of the world's most important story. That is not an accident. That is Tolkien. Let us talk about what Legolas can actually do, because this is where the gap between the films and the books opens into something genuinely important. In the films, Legolas is defined almost entirely by his physical feats. The shield surfing at Helm's Deep, the Oliphant sequence, the arrow catching, the impossible gymnastics, the body count delivered with balletic precision. Peter Jackson's Legolas is a kinetic argument for elvish supremacy, a visual demonstration that elves are faster, sharper, more capable than anything mortal existence can produce. And in a narrow sense, this is true to the lore. Elves are faster. Their senses are keener. Their bodies do not fatigue the way mortal bodies do. Legolas canonically sees further than any other member of the Fellowship, canonically moves more quietly, canonically requires less sleep. These are real attributes, established in the text. But here is what the text also establishes, and what the films quietly buried. In the Dead Marshes, Frodo and Sam and Gollum pass through a landscape of ancient horror, and when Legolas walks there, he is disturbed. Not in a way he can fully articulate or explain. The Tolkien text gives him a kind of elvish unease, a sensitivity to the shadow of the place that registers as something close to fear, except that wood elves do not easily name what they feel because their lore is thinner, their capacity to contextualize ancient evil more limited than that of the Noldor, or even the Sindar who lived through the First Age's catastrophes. At the borders of Fangorn, Legolas hesitates. He perceives the age of the forest, the weight of it, the sentience moving underneath it, and he is awed into near stillness. This is not the response of a supremely confident elvish warrior who has seen everything. This is the response of someone encountering a depth of ancient existence that exceeds his own. And this is the detail that matters. Legolas is not ancient by elvish standards. Tolkien never gives him a firm birth date, which is itself telling. In a legendarium where the Noldor who returned from Valinor were born before the sun existed and carry the memory of a world that is literally gone, Legolas is comparatively young. He is old by mortal reckoning, yes, but by the measure of elvish experience, he is not a figure of the deep past. He is not Galadriel, who was born in Valinor and watched the trees burn. He is not Elrond, who was present at the fall of Númenor. He is not even Glorfindel, who died fighting a Balrog in the First Age and was reborn to fight again. Legolas is a wood elf prince of uncertain age, from a relatively young realm, whose people have consciously chosen to be less connected to the great currents of lore and power that run through elvish history. Picture this: Rivendell at night, the Fellowship newly formed, gathered around fires that reflect off the carved stone faces of ancient kings and heroes. Gandalf speaks of Morgoth, and ages that predate memory. Aragorn, who has been walking through history for decades, adds details from his time with the Rangers. Gimli mentions the halls of Khazad-dûm with the confidence of someone whose people built them, and Legolas listens. He knows his part of the world with extraordinary depth: the forest, the sounds in the dark, the movement of things the others cannot see. But the deeper history, the history that fills Rivendell's libraries and that Elrond could recite from personal memory, that belongs to a world his people chose, thousands of years ago, not to be part of. He is good at what he is. But what he is not what the films made him. Now this is the part that changes everything. Because here is the question the films never asked, and the one this script has been building toward from the beginning. If Legolas is ordinary, if he is from the least prestigious elvish culture, if he is young by elvish standards and limited in the deep lore that defines figures like Gandalf or Elrond or Galadriel, then what does it mean that he does what he does? The films gave Legolas superhuman feats and explained them through the shorthand of elvish superiority. He can do these things because he is an elf, and elves are magical, and that is sufficient. The audience does not need to understand more, because the films are not asking them to. But Tolkien is asking something more. Tolkien is asking, What does it cost an ordinary member of a forgotten kindred to stand in the company of the great and hold his ground? Because that is what Legolas actually does in the text. He does not surf shields or climb oliphants in Tolkien's writing. Those are Jackson's inventions. What Legolas does in the book is something quieter and, once you see it, more remarkable. He endures. He is present at Moria. He descends into the dark. He walks through the horror of the mines and the loss of Gandalf and does not break. He moves through Lothlorien and is moved to tears by it, genuinely overwhelmed by the beauty of a forest that represents everything the Sylvan world might have been if history had been kinder. He fights at Helm's Deep. He pursues the Uruk-hai across the plains of Rohan at a pace that outlasts every mortal member of the group, but is always calibrated to stay with them, to remain part of the Fellowship, even after the Fellowship has formally dissolved. He stands on the walls of the world's last battles and draws his bow. And none of this is framed in the text as the triumph of elvish supremacy. It is framed as the faithfulness of one elf who showed up when asked and did not leave. Here is the thing that lands hardest, and it requires one more layer of lore to fully understand. The elvish hierarchy is not merely cultural snobbery. It has a cosmological basis that Tolkien believed in as seriously as he believed in anything in his mythology. The light of Valinor, the light of the two trees that the Silmarils captured and that Erendil carries across the sky. That light is the primordial creative energy of Arda, the most direct expression of the Valar's power and by extension of Ilúvatar's intent for the world. To have stood in that light is to have been touched by a kind of grace. The Noldor carry it. The Vanyar carry it most purely of all. Even the Sindar, who were bathed in the reflected light of the stars and of Valinor's glow across the sea, carry a version of it. The Sylvan elves do not. They are the elves of the dark, not because they chose darkness over light in any morally loaded sense, but because they chose the forests and the earth, and the world as it was, over the journey toward the world as it might be. They are the elves for whom Middle-earth itself was enough. And in Tolkien's theological framework, where the light of Valinor represents something genuinely salvific and transformative, the absence of that light in the Sylvan elves is not a neutral fact. It is a lack, a real one. A cosmological deficit that cannot be fully compensated for by anything they do or become within Middle-earth. Legolas carries that deficit into everything he does, and Tolkien sends him anyway. Pay attention to this next part, because it is where the entire argument resolves. In Letter 297, writing about the nature of heroism in his mythology, Tolkien returns to a theme he visits again and again, that the most significant acts in the history of Arda are performed not by those most equipped to perform them, but by those most unexpectedly placed to perform them. The destruction of the One Ring is not accomplished by Gandalf or Aragorn or Galadriel. It is accomplished, fumblingly and at terrible cost, by a hobbit who cannot bring himself to let it go in the end, and a creature who falls into a volcano because he cannot let it go either. The salvation of Gondor at the Pelennor Fields is not accomplished by the greatest warrior present. It is accomplished by a woman and a hobbit who were not supposed to be there. And the free peoples of Middle-earth are represented at the Fellowship's heart, not by Glorfindel or a Noldorin lord of Rivendell. They are represented, in part, by a wood elf prince whose people turned back from the great journey before the world had even learned to dream of the sun. This is Tolkien's cosmological argument about who history belongs to. It is not the shining, the mighty, the lore deep, the Valinor touched. It belongs to whoever shows up and holds the line when the dark comes down. And Legolas shows up, every time, without prophecy, without supernatural mandate, without the backing of overwhelming ancient power. He shows up because he was asked, and because he is the kind of being who says yes to that kind of asking. Picture this: the Argonath, two enormous figures carved from living rock, kings of Gondor from the age before Sauron was defeated the last time, standing with hands raised in warning against all enemies of the realm. The Fellowship passes between them in small boats on the River Anduin, looking up at these stone faces, these monuments to a power that no longer fully exists in the world. Aragorn sees them and is humbled by the recognition of what he is heir to. Boromir sees them and feels the weight of a kingdom that has been diminishing for his entire lifetime. The hobbits are simply overwhelmed. And Legolas looks up at them and sees, with his elvish eyes, details no one else can see. The exact craft of the carving, the weathering of centuries. He can see further than anyone else in the boat. His perception is genuinely extraordinary in this moment. But these monuments are not his monuments. This history is not his history. Gondor's long defeat means nothing to the woodland realm except as a distant geopolitical fact. These kings did not protect his people. His people were fighting Sauron's orcs in the forest of Mirkwood through the entire long defeat of Gondor, largely alone, without the support of the southern kingdoms, without recognition, without anyone carving statues of Thranduil's soldiers on the banks of any river. Legolas passes between those great stone hands, and he sees everything, and none of it is his. And he keeps going. That is who this elf is. Let us go back to the Council of Elrond, because there is something else happening there that the film compresses beyond recognition, and it matters for understanding what Legolas's presence means. The Council is not just a strategy meeting. It is, in structural terms, the first time representatives of all the free peoples have sat together in the same room since, arguably, the last alliance of elves and men at the end of the Second Age. And the history of that last alliance is complicated in ways that matter directly to the wood elves of Mirkwood. Unfinished Tales tells us that Orifer, Thranduil's father, led the Sylvan elves of Mirkwood into the War of the Last Alliance. He did not do so comfortably or cooperatively. He resented the assumption by Gil-galad and the Noldor that the elvish armies would march under Noldorin command, and he and his Sylvan elves advanced prematurely, before the signal was given, eager to prove their worth and perhaps also to avoid being subordinated to a chain of command that would treat them as lesser. The result was catastrophic. The Sylvan elves took massive casualties. Orifer himself was killed. Thranduil survived, but his people came home devastated, and the pride and pain of that unnecessary slaughter shaped the woodland realm's relationship to the wider elvish world for the entire Third Age. This is the inheritance Legolas carries into the Council of Elrond. The Mirkwood elves have been here before. They came when called, they were treated as lesser, they led with pride rather than strategy, and they were destroyed. And then they went home to their forest, and rebuilt and fought Sauron's shadow in Mirkwood alone for 3,000 years, while the great powers of the West argued about what to do. So when Legolas stands at the Council of Elrond and delivers his message about Gollum's escape, he is not just one elf delivering one report. He is the son of the king who watched his father die because elvish hierarchy placed Mirkwood's soldiers at the bottom of a chain of command built by people who considered them lesser. And then he volunteers to go anyway. Or he is chosen. The text leaves it slightly ambiguous. But either way, he goes. That is not ordinary. That is something that requires a specific kind of courage that has nothing to do with being fast with a bow. There is another layer here, and it comes from the Silmarillion's account of what the Sylvan elves did and did not inherit from the Elder Days. The Noldor who came back from Valinor at the beginning of the First Age carried with them the full weight of elvish cultural achievement. The crafting of the Silmarils, the development of Feanor's linguistic and technical genius, the deep knowledge of the Valar, and the cosmological structure of Arda, the memory of a world the sun had not yet touched. They were, in the most literal sense, the most educated and the most powerful beings in Middle-earth, carrying gifts given to them by the Valar directly. The Sindar had developed their own high culture in Beleriand, had built kingdoms, had cultivated the long tradition of their own lore and music and craft. Less than the Noldor in terms of raw Valinor-given power, but still deeply sophisticated and deeply historical. The Sylvan Elves had the forest. They had their songs, which were more directly rooted in the natural world than any other elvish tradition. They had their deep attunement to living things, to the cycles of growth and season, to the language of trees, in a way that Tolkien implies is its own form of knowledge, not lesser than Noldorin lore, but different, answering different questions. What they did not have was the kind of lore that helps you navigate the politics of the free peoples, or interpret the movements of Sauron, or understand the deep history of the Rings of Power, or recognize a Maya when you see one. The grand strategic picture of the War of the Ring is beyond the natural scope of Sylvan Elvish knowledge. Legolas goes into Moria with Gandalf and does not fully understand what Gandalf is. He knows Mithrandir as the wandering wizard who sometimes moves through the forests of Mirkwood and who is counted among the wise. But the specific nature of the Istari, the fact that they are Maiar in diminished form sent by the Valar to help Middle-earth resist Sauron, this is Noldorin lore, Sindarin High Council lore, the kind of thing Elrond knows in his bones because he was there when these decisions were made. Legolas walks beside Gandalf through the darkness of Khazad-dûm and fights beside him and then watches him fall, and he grieves, genuinely grieves. Because what he understands of Gandalf is what a wood elf understands, a being of warmth and power and unpredictable goodness who made the world safer when he was in it. The rest, the cosmic significance of what just fell into the shadow, he will learn later, slowly, as the others explain it. And he keeps fighting anyway. Before he fully understands what he has lost, he keeps fighting. Because that is what the Sylvan Elves learned in the forest. That you fight the dark, even when you do not fully understand the dark, because understanding has never been the precondition for courage. Picture this. The plains of Rohan, 3 figures running. Aragorn, a Dunedain ranger who has been walking at the edge of endurance for decades and has the stamina of Númenórean blood behind him. Gimli, a dwarf whose people are built for sustained physical effort in a way that no other race quite matches. And Legolas. Tolkien describes this pursuit of the Uruk-hai across the plains of Rohan as something close to superhuman in its duration. They run for 3 days, without meaningful rest. The trail is cold, and the gap seems impossible to close. And Tolkien writes that Legolas moves through this landscape as though the ground itself is less of an obstacle for him, his elvish lightness, such that he barely leaves footprints, his endurance simply of a different category than the mortal members of the group. This is real, this is canonical. Legolas is genuinely faster, genuinely lighter, genuinely more physically capable of sustained effort than his companions. But here is what the text is actually doing in this sequence. It is not showcasing elvish superiority. It is showcasing what it looks like when all 3 of them use everything they are. Aragorn uses the Númenórean will, and the ranger's knowledge of tracking, and the sheer stubbornness of a man who has been waiting for this purpose his entire life. Gimli uses dwarven endurance, and the pride of a race that does not admit to having limits until they have exceeded them. And Legolas uses what a wood elf uses. The earth, the air, the feeling in his feet of which direction things have gone, the sense that the living world around him is telling him something if he runs lightly enough to hear it. 3 different kinds of endurance. 3 different inheritances. None of them, in this moment, more or less than the others. Each one bringing exactly what their people have to give. This is the fellowship even after the fellowship has dissolved. This is what Tolkien meant by 9 walkers representing the free peoples. Not that one of them would be the obvious champion, but that each one would bring what they are, unreservedly, until the thing is done. We are about halfway through what this argument needs to say, and now the register has to change slightly. Because everything up to this point has been establishing what Legolas is not, and what he is, and why both of those things matter within the mechanics of Tolkien's world. But there is a thread that has been running underneath all of this that has not been named yet, and naming it is where the argument reaches its real depth. It is the thread of what the Sylvan Elves were waiting for. Because the Sylvan Elves did not turn back from the great journey because they were weak or afraid or short-sighted. Tolkien is not writing them as failures. He is writing them as a different kind of answer to the same question every elf had to answer at Cuiviénen. What does it mean to be elvish? What is the elvish life for? The Noldor answered, for achievement, for craft, for knowing the deepest things and making the most beautiful things, and pushing the limits of what existence can do. And they were magnificent, and they were catastrophic. Because achievement without wisdom is exactly as dangerous as Tolkien's entire First Age demonstrates. The Vanyar answered, for devotion, for closeness to the Valar, and through the Valar to Ilúvatar. They went to Valinor, and they stayed there, and they were the most purely faithful of all the elvish kindreds, and they are therefore almost entirely absent from Middle-earth's history, because faithful devotion in a safe place is not a story. It is a condition, the Sindar answered, for kingship and culture in the world as it is, for building something beautiful in Middle-earth itself, in Beleriand, in the forests and the rivers and the stone, without needing to cross the sea to justify the building. And they were noble, and they were eventually destroyed, because Middle-earth is where Morgoth and then Sauron operate, and beauty in a place where evil lives is always provisional. The Sylvan Elves answered, for the world itself, for the forest, for the long, deep, unhurried experience of being alive in Middle-earth without agenda, without the drive to achieve, or the requirement to be faithful to a power outside themselves, or the ambition to build kingdoms. They chose to be in the world the way the world is, not as a destination or a project, but as a home. And there is something in Tolkien's treatment of them that suggests this answer, while cosmologically lesser in terms of the light they carry, is also somehow true in a way the other answers only partially manage. Because the Noldor's answer led to the kinslaying, the Sindar's answer led to Doriath falling. The Vanyar's answer led to them being absent when it mattered, and the Sylvan Elves' answer led to them still being in Middle-earth, in the forests, in Mirkwood and Lothlorien and the scattered woodland communities of the age, present and alive and fighting when everything else was ending. They are the ones who stayed. Now return to the central question with everything the previous sections have built behind it. Did Tolkien make Legolas ordinary on purpose? Yes. But let the word ordinary carry its full weight now, because it means something different than it did when this question was first asked. Ordinary does not mean mediocre. Ordinary does not mean inadequate. Ordinary means, in the precise Tolkienian sense, not marked by the extraordinary light. Not elevated by Valinor's grace, not named in prophecy, not sent back from the halls of Mandos with a specific mission, not chosen by a Maya, or guided by a ring, or shaped by the great catastrophic forces that remade every other significant elvish figure in the legendarium. Legolas is ordinary in the way that a tree is ordinary. He grows where he was planted. He is what his inheritance made him. He brings to the fellowship the exact capabilities of his people and no others. He is not more than a wood elf because nothing has happened to make him more than a wood elf. And Tolkien sends exactly that elf into the fellowship, into Moria, into Lothlorien, where Legolas is moved to tears by beauty that represents everything his people never had access to, into Rohan and Helm's Deep and Minas Tirith, and finally, at the last, to the Black Gate. The question has changed. It is no longer asking whether Legolas is special. It is asking something harder. What does it mean for a being without special status, without supernatural mandate, without the deep light of Valinor, to stand at the center of the world's most important story and not flinch? Hold that, because the answer is coming. But it requires one more piece. Tolkien's letters contain something rarely quoted in discussions of Legolas, partly because it does not mention him directly. In Letter 131, one of the longest and most important letters he ever wrote about the mythology, Tolkien describes the central theme of The Lord of the Rings as the problem of power and the corruption it brings, and he says something that cuts straight to the heart of why the Fellowship was assembled the way it was. He writes that the great danger of the ring is not that it gives power to evil beings, it is that it gives power to good ones. That the ring's deepest temptation is not be evil, but use this to do more good than you could otherwise do. That every great figure who reaches for the ring reaches for it believing they will use it better than Sauron. And that this belief, however sincere, is the exact mechanism of their corruption. Tolkien then draws the conclusion that follows, that only those who want the ring least, or who understand with absolute clarity what wanting it would cost them, can be trusted anywhere near it, and that the beings most likely to want it least are the ones who have had the fewest reasons to believe they could reshape the world through force of will. Not the Noldor, who have spent ages believing that enough craft and enough power can fix anything, who made the rings of power themselves as an expression of that belief. Not the Sindar lords, whose kingdoms were built and held through strategic mastery. Not even Gandalf, who carries the memory of Valinor, and who is explicitly shown in the text wrestling with the temptation of the ring. The hobbits, and the wood elves. Because the hobbits have never believed they could reshape the world, they are constitutionally humble in a way that their very smallness enforces. They are not tempted by the ring's offer of world historical importance, because world historical importance is not something they have ever wanted. And the Sylvan elves, the ones who turned back from the great journey, the ones who stayed in the forest, the ones who chose the world as it is over the world as it might be transformed into, they are not tempted by the ring's offer of transformation, because transformation into something greater is not what they value. They value what already is. The ring promises you can remake the world in your image. The Sylvan answer, carried in the bone of their culture across ages of the world, is, the world does not need to be remade, it needs to be loved. Legolas, standing at the Council of Elrond, hearing Frodo volunteer to carry the ring to Mordor, would not have wanted the ring. Not because he lacked the strength to carry it, not because he feared it, but because it offered him nothing he wanted. The ring whispers to each person in the language of their deepest desire. To Boromir it whispers strength for Gondor. To Gandalf, it whispers the power to finally order the world correctly. To Galadriel it whispers the queenship she has long deserved. To Legolas, a son of the forest who has never wanted more than what the forest already is, the ring has nothing to say. He is, in this precise and cosmological sense, immune. Not because he is strong, because he is exactly what he is. Picture this. Lothlorien, the Fellowship, exhausted and grieving for Gandalf, is led into the Golden Wood by Haldir and the Galadrim. And Legolas, who has been largely stoic through the mines, through the shadow, through the loss of the Grey Pilgrim, begins to weep. Not dramatically, but unmistakably, he weeps at the beauty of the place. In the books, Tolkien gives him a line that is almost impossible to render in film because it requires the reader to understand what Lothlorien represents to someone of Sylvan descent. Legolas looks at the trees and hears them. Not the way humans hear trees, as background, as scenery. He hears them the way his people hear all living things, as presences with their own inner life, speaking in a language deeper than words. And what Lothlorien's trees tell him is a story of what the Sylvan world could have been. Lothlorien is not Mirkwood. It is protected by Galadriel's ring, by Nenya, and what Nenya does is preserve. It holds time back. It keeps Lothlorien in a state of pristine existence that the rest of the elvish world has long since surrendered to the grinding attrition of the Third Age. Mirkwood was never protected like that. Mirkwood got the shadow. Mirkwood got Dol Guldur. Mirkwood's trees grew twisted and dark, and the Sylvan elves of Thranduil's realm have been fighting to preserve their corner of the world against a darkness that has been leaking into it for 3,000 years. Legolas walks into Lothlorien and sees what might have been. If Galadriel had come to Mirkwood, if a ring of power had been there to hold the shadow back, if history had been different in the ways that matter most. And he weeps, and then he stops weeping, and then he walks forward. Because this is what the Sylvan elves do. They grieve what is lost, and they stay in the world anyway. They look at what might have been, and then they return to what is. This is not resignation. It is the specific form of courage that belongs to beings who chose the world over the light, and have spent all of history honoring that choice, even as the world has been unkind to them in return. There is a moment late in The Return of the King that almost no one discusses in the context of Legolas, because it is quiet, and because the films convert it into a different kind of action scene. It is the moment at the Paths of the Dead. Aragorn leads a small company, including Legolas and Gimli, through the mountain pass to summon the dead men of Dunharrow, the army of the dead, who are bound by an unbreakable oath to serve the heir of Isildur. The passage through the Paths of the Dead is described by Tolkien as one of the most harrowing experiences in the entire narrative. The darkness is absolute. The dead are present as pressure and cold, and a kind of terror that reaches into the most fundamental levels of existence. Gimli is barely holding together. Aragorn moves forward through will alone, sustained by the identity he has finally accepted and the oath he is going to enforce. The other members of the company struggle. Legolas is calm. Not falsely calm, not supernaturally unaffected, but genuinely at ease, in a darkness that destroys everyone else. And Tolkien gives a reason for this, not explicitly in this scene, but in the broader context of elvish existence. Elves do not fear death the way mortals fear it, because death, for an elf, is not an ending, but a different kind of continuity. They go to the halls of Mandos. They wait. They may be rehoused. The dead are not, for an elf, something existentially foreign in the way they are for mortals. They are just other elves who are waiting in a different place. Legolas walks through the Paths of the Dead without the terror the others feel, because his relationship to death is different, not better, not easier, different. His people have been dying in Mirkwood for 3,000 years, fighting the shadow, and they have held the knowledge of what death means for their kind across all of that time without it destroying them. Because elvish death is not nothing, it is not oblivion, it is continuation by other means. This is not a superpower, it is cultural knowledge. It is what happens when you belong to a people who have lived close to death, in a corrupted forest, without the protection of a ring of power, without the high walls of Rivendell or the preserved timelessness of Lothlorien, for thousands of years, and kept going anyway. The Paths of the Dead are, in a strange way, more familiar to Legolas than to almost anyone else in that company. He has been walking through shadow for his whole life. And here is where the emotional core of the argument arrives. Here is where the lore becomes something more than lore. After the War of the Ring is over, after Sauron is defeated and the ring is destroyed, and the age turns, the elves begin to leave. The ones who carry the light of Valinor, the Noldor and the Sindar who held elvish civilization together across the Third Age. They have always been going. The diminishment of their power, the fading of the elvish world, the rising of the Age of Men, all of it was leading toward the grey havens and the white ships and the sea. Galadriel goes. She carries Nenya west, and the light that kept Lothlorien alive goes with her, and the forest fades. Elrond goes. He carries the memory of every age of the world west with him, and Rivendell empties. Gandalf goes, because his mission is complete, and Valinor is where Maiar belong. And Legolas? Tolkien tells us, in the appendices, that Legolas was the last of the Fellowship to leave Middle-earth. He remained for a time after the others. He eventually built ships and sailed west, and he took Gimli with him, the first and perhaps only dwarf to ever make that crossing. And before he left, Tolkien implies, he spent time in the forests, walking in them, being in them. The Sylvan elves who did not sail, who remained in Middle-earth after the age of the elves ended, they faded, not dramatically, not into darkness. They became part of the world, quieter and quieter, until they were whispers in the trees, presences that could be felt but not fully seen. The forest remembers them, the trees carry something of what they were. This is the fate that Legolas chose, at least partly, before finally going west. He stayed with the forest. He stayed with the world he belonged to. And when he left with a dwarf by his side, a being from a kindred that has had its own complicated relationship with elvish hierarchy since the very beginning of the Legendarium, and the two of them sailed west together. Which is, if you understand what the Grey Havens represents, and what the sea crossing means, one of the most extraordinary images Tolkien left in his mythology. Because Gimli should not be able to make that crossing. Dwarves are not the children of Ilúvatar in the same sense as elves and men. They are Aule's creation, sanctioned by Ilúvatar but not originally planned, and the fate of dwarves is uncertain in ways that elven fate is not. For Gimli to cross the sea requires either Galadriel's special intercession or a bending of the laws of Arda that Tolkien leaves somewhat ambiguous. But Legolas takes him. A wood elf, the son of a Sindarin king ruling a Sylvan people, the least prestigious elvish representative the Free Peoples could have sent into the Fellowship, takes a dwarf across the sea to Valinor. If that is not extraordinary, then extraordinary has lost its meaning. Picture this, the Grey Havens at the end of the Third Age, the white ships waiting, the sea ahead, impossibly wide, leading to a shore that most of the world has never seen and never will. The great figures of the age are there, completing what they came to do. Gandalf returning to his nature, Galadriel returning to her birthright, Elrond going to his wife who waits for him in Valinor, and to a rest he has more than earned after 3 ages of labor. And somewhere in this, not at the center, not as the focus, not as the protagonist of the moment, Legolas. A wood elf, a prince of Mirkwood, someone who was not supposed to be in any of the great events he participated in, who was there as a representative of the forgotten kindreds, who brought the Sylvan elves into the Fellowship, and the Fellowship into the most important story of the age, standing at the prow of a ship, looking west. He has done what his people never did at Cuiviénen. He is making the journey his ancestors turned back from. He is going toward the light, and he is bringing a dwarf. Nothing about this was foretold. No prophecy named this moment. No Vala arranged for it. It is the consequence of choices made by ordinary beings across the length of an extraordinary war. Choices that accumulated into something that changed the rules of the world, slightly, permanently, in the direction of a dwarf standing on a ship headed for Valinor, because a wood elf decided that friendship was worth more than hierarchy. This is what Tolkien built, not in the foreground, in the architecture underneath. Let us return now to the elvish hierarchy one final time, because there is a reversal in the lore that most readers miss, and that changes the entire meaning of Legolas's ending. The distinction between Calaquendi and Morroquendi, between light elves and dark elves, the distinction that has underwritten every moment of Legolas's cultural subordination across the entire story, is built on one thing: who went to Valinor and who did not. Legolas is Morroquendi. His people are Morroquendi. They never made the journey. They never stood in the light of the 2 trees. They never saw what Valinor was. Their entire elvish existence has been defined by the absence of that experience, the thing they chose not to have, or that their ancestors chose for them. Until Legolas sails west. He makes it. He crosses the sea. He arrives in Valinor, the son of Thranduil, king of the woodland realm, prince of the Sylvan elves, wood elf, Morroquendi, the least prestigious elvish representative the Free Peoples could have placed in the Fellowship, arrives in the Undying Lands. Tolkien does not write what happens next. He leaves it where the appendices leave it, at the shore of the sea, with the ship sailing. We do not know what Legolas finds in Valinor. We do not know what he is when he gets there. We do not know whether the cosmological hierarchy that defined him as lesser, as dark, as untouched by the primordial light, shifts when he finally stands in the place where that light once lived. But here is what the cosmological logic of Tolkien's world suggests, if you follow it carefully. The two trees are gone. The light that defined the Calaquendi is not in Valinor anymore, in the direct form that transformed the elves who originally went. What remains is its reflection, its memory, its preservation in the undying lands, as a kind of permanent sacred echo. The distinction between Calaquendi and Morroquendi was always about access to an experience that has itself already been destroyed. When Legolas arrives in Valinor, he arrives as an elf who has done something that most Calaquendi never did. He has stood in the middle of Middle-earth's darkest hour and held his ground without the backing of Valinor's grace, without supernatural enhancement, without prophecy or destiny, or a ring of power to sustain him. He has been to Moria and Lothlorien and Helm's Deep and the Paths of the Dead and Minas Tirith and the Black Gate as himself, as a wood elf, bringing everything his people were and no more. What the Valar make of that, Tolkien does not say. But it is hard to believe they would find it small. And now the argument arrives at its final question, and this time it is heavier than when it was first asked, because everything that has been built behind it has changed its weight beyond recognition. Did Tolkien make Legolas ordinary on purpose? Yes. But now ordinary means something it did not mean at the beginning. It means not elevated by external grace, not marked by destiny, not protected by the deep light that the cosmos decided, thousands of years before Legolas existed, to give to some elves and withhold from others. Ordinary means carrying only what his people gave him, through their choice and their history and their long faithfulness to a world that was never fully kind to them. And here is what that makes every one of his feats. Not a demonstration of elvish power, not a display of the capabilities of a superior race, but a quiet argument running underneath the entire story, made in arrow flights and endurance, and the specific courage of someone who has no supernatural backing, that the forgotten kindreds, the ones who turned back from the light, the ones who stayed in the forest while history happened elsewhere, were never as small as the world decided they were. Every arrow Legolas looses is the Nandor at Cuiviénen, choosing the world over the journey, and being right. Every step he takes beside Aragorn and Gimli and the hobbits is Mirkwood enduring the shadow for 3,000 years without a ring of power to hold it back. Every moment he keeps going when the Fellowship keeps dissolving around him is Orifa's people coming home after the last alliance, devastated and uncredited and still there, still fighting, still part of the story. He is not extraordinary because he was made exceptional. He is extraordinary because what he was made of turned out to be enough. Power in Tolkien's world is always borrowed. The Noldor borrowed it from Valinor's light. The Rings of Power borrowed it from their makers. The Nazgul borrowed it from the One Ring and the will of Sauron. Even Gandalf is borrowed power in a sense, a Maya housed in a form that can interact with Middle-earth, sustained by the mission given to him by the Valar. The great and the mighty in Tolkien's world are almost always drawing on something outside themselves, something they carry but did not generate. The Sylvan elves borrowed nothing. They stayed in the world with what the world gave them, and they became what the world made them, beings of the earth and the forest and the long dark, with a knowledge of living things that no Noldorin lord ever quite achieved, with a relationship to Middle-earth itself that is more intimate and more ancient than any imported Valinor-born civilization. This is not a consolation. Tolkien is not saying it is fine that they did not go to Valinor, they had other gifts. He is saying something more precise and more uncomfortable than that. He is saying the cosmological hierarchy that places the Calaquendi above the Morroquendi is real. The light of Valinor is real and it does something. but a hierarchy built on a journey, on a single collective choice made in the earliest dark of the world, has a question running underneath it that the hierarchy can never fully answer. What about the ones who said no to the journey, but yes to the world? What about the ones who loved Middle-earth so much they would not leave it, even for Valinor? What about the Sylvan Elves, who were still there, still in the forest, still fighting, still singing in the trees, when the age turned and the mightier kindreds sailed west and left the world to men? Tolkien does not fully answer this question. His Catholicism gives him a framework that values obedience to divine invitation, and the Valar's invitation to Valinor was the closest thing in Arda to divine invitation. The Nandor's refusal has cosmological consequences that are real and lasting. But Tolkien also wrote Samwise Gamgee as the true hero of The Lord of the Rings, in his own letter, in his own words. He wrote Pippin stopping the charge of a trolls simply by being underneath it when it fell. He wrote Éowyn breaking the Witch King not through power, but through the particular courage of someone fighting beyond the limits of what they were supposed to be. He was not a writer who equated hierarchy with worth. He was a writer who believed, deeply and structurally and theologically, that the worthiest acts are often performed by those the hierarchy has already written off. Legolas is the elvish expression of that belief. He is the elf Tolkien sent to remind the elvish world that the ones who stayed were not nothing. That the journey to Valinor was not the only measure. That 3,000 years of fighting a darkness alone in a corrupted forest, without recognition, without a ring of power, without anyone carving your fathers' faces in stone on the banks of rivers, counts. That it is real, that it matters. And that at the end, when the story is over, and the great ones are sailing west, and the age of the elves is finished, a wood elf walks to the shore, and makes the journey his ancestors turned back from, because he has earned the right to make it in a way that has nothing to do with bloodline, or standing, or proximity to Valinor's light. He earned it in Moria. He earned it on the plains of Rohan. He earned it at the Black Gate, standing with a dwarf beside him, because the Fellowship made him into someone who could love across the oldest boundary in dwarven elvish history. He earned it by being what he was, and having it be enough. Ask yourself now, sitting with everything this script has built across the full length of this argument, whether the question you arrived with is the one you are leaving with. Was Legolas special, or just an ordinary elf? He was ordinary in the precise sense that matters most. He was not given more than his people gave him. He carried no grace he did not earn, no destiny he did not choose, no supernatural backing beyond the capabilities of his kindred. He was a wood elf from a forest realm that even the elvish world considered lesser, and he walked into the center of the world's last great war without flinching. And if you still want to call that ordinary, then maybe ordinary is the word that needed to change all along. Maybe ordinary, in Tolkien's world, is not the absence of something. Maybe it is the presence of everything a being can be, when what they are is simply themselves, fully, faithfully, without augmentation, without Valinor's light, without the backing of powers that remake beings into something greater than their own nature. Maybe the Sylvan Elves, the ones who said no to the journey and yes to the world, were not cosmological failures. Maybe they were, in their own quiet way, the most honest answer to the question of what it means to love Arda, not as a stepping stone to somewhere better, but as the place itself, worthy of every arrow and every sleepless night and every mile run across its surface. And Tolkien, who loved the earth the way Legolas loves his forest, who built his mythology around the specific tragedy and dignity of things that are loved and lost, and yet still worth having been, who made a hobbit the hero of his epic, precisely because heroism needs no prior authorization from the cosmos, sent exactly that elf, from exactly that people, into the heart of his story. Not despite his ordinariness, because of it. This is what I keep thinking about, and what I think the films, for all their extraordinary achievement, could not quite give us. Legolas as theological argument rather than action sequence. Legolas as Tolkien's quiet insistence that the forgotten kindreds matter. That the ones who stayed in the dark and loved the world anyway were never as small as the world's hierarchies decided. If that changes how you see him, if you can now watch even the Jackson films and see underneath the shield surfing to the wood elf from Mirkwood, who was never supposed to be there, but who showed up anyway and did not flinch, then this is what this channel is for. Not to replace the experience of the story, to deepen it, to find the architecture underneath and show you how much was always there. Tell me in the comments, which elvish kindred do you think gets the least credit in Tolkien's world? Because I think the Sylvan Elves are only the beginning of that conversation, and I want to hear where you think it goes. And if you want to keep going deeper into the parts of the legendarium that most adaptations have never touched, the channel is here, and there is a great deal more to find.